typically I would go through all the questions and give you an opportunity to answer them on your sheet and kind of go through that slowly, but I've been only given 45 minutes tonight, and you've had enough presentations from me to know that I don't stay within the time zone very well. So we're not going to do that because you got it already, so hopefully you had time to fill those out, just to see how much knowledge you might have beforehand, and then how much you learned tonight from this presentation. So, there are all the questions. Again, you have them in front of you, and hopefully you had a chance to go through those. So we're going to do Holy Week, Jesus's and the churches, okay? So let's just get a basic understanding of Israel if you haven't been there, if you haven't really studied it much. So Israel is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. Almost the furthest east you can get on the Mediterranean is the coastline of Israel. It is also in the continent of Asia, and it's kind of on the western side of Asia, but on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And as you can see here, the Sea of Galilee is on the northern side of Israel, and this is super important to Jesus' ministry. We'll actually talk a little bit about the area that Jesus preached in during my homily tonight for our handing on of the Creed. But just for your knowledge, the Sea of Galilee is up there. Oopsie. And then out of the Sea of Galilee comes the River Jordan. Jesus is baptized in the River Jordan. It's a very lush and almost sort of like a wooded area, I think, my understanding is, at the time of Jesus. And then that dumps down into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level, and so the water comes in, it evaporates out. Any sort of salt content in the water stays then in the Dead Sea. And the reason it's called the Dead Sea is because it is so salty that nothing, or only maybe a few microorganisms can actually live there. But it is the lowest spot on the surface of the earth. So 1,300 feet below sea level, it's the lowest spot. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and it is on the southern portion. It's in Judea, and it is pretty close, not very close, to Nazareth. So Nazareth is up north, near the Sea of Galilee, and so Mary and Joseph traveled probably 60-ish miles to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem. In fact, probably even more than that, because Israel is very mountainous. And so it's not really easy to make a straight shot from too many places to too many other places. So it was actually probably a longer journey for them, especially if they were avoiding Samaria, which a lot of Jews would do, just because Jews and Samaritans didn't really get along very well. We learned that this weekend, right, in the gospel. Okay, Capernaum, which was Jesus' home base during his 3 years of ministry, is on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. It sits right on the sea, and it's beautiful up there, and so you can kind of understand why Jesus would have wanted to spend at least his home base time there. And what we're going to talk about tonight is the city of Jerusalem, which is about 4 miles north of Bethlehem. And it sits about 2,500 feet above sea level. And so it sits about 4,000 feet above the Dead Sea. And we'll talk briefly about that at some point tonight. So, okay, so this is first century Jerusalem. And I'm going to get away from the mic and just kind of talk as loud as I can here, okay? Okay, so the area that David would have known when he conquered is kind of more just this area right here. That's as big as Jerusalem was at the time. By the time Jesus comes around, it had expanded to this tan area, the darker tan area going around there, including the lower city down here. And then after Jesus passes, after Jesus' time, Jerusalem continues to be occupied until 70 AD when it's destroyed by the Romans. And before that, to protect it, because Jerusalem is always attacked from the north, because it's higher up here than it is down here. In order to protect it, the Jews had built more walls. So that's the extent of Jerusalem in 70 AD when it's destroyed, okay? You have two valleys that go around it. On the east is the Kidron Valley. And so we'll talk about that here in just a second. And then further east of that is the Mount of Olives, okay? To the west and the south is the Hinnom Valley. And you're familiar with the term Gehenna, right? It's one of the terms that Jesus uses to describe hell. And the reason he used that is because it immediately clicked with his listeners when he talked about Gehenna, which comes from Hinnom here. That was the area where the Canaanites sacrificed their children to their gods. I said that correctly. They sacrificed their children to their gods. Okay? When the Israelites got to the area, they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That is messed up. That's a problem. That place is cursed. So we're not going to build right in the valley. Not that you would build in a valley anyway, because it's going to fill with water. But instead, they threw their trash in there. And then they would light their trash to burn it. So Jesus, in using this image, he uses it for hell because why? Innocence is lost there. Children were killed there. It is cursed. It's full of trash. And it's always on fire. And it's a low place. So all of those images were able to pop to people's heads when Jesus talks about Gehenna and when he equates hell with Gehenna. Okay? Okay. So inside that box is the temple. Now there were two temples. Solomon built his temple around 960 AD and 950 AD, or sorry, BC. And it survived for 400 years until it was destroyed by the Babylonians when they came and they conquered the rest of Israel. The Assyrians had already conquered the northern tribes. The Babylonians came in and they finished off the job and they conquered the southern tribes, including Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple. Well, when Cyrus and the Persians conquered the Babylonians, Cyrus had this policy to allow people to practice their religion, and he allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem from Babylonia, and he even allowed them to rebuild their temple. So the temple is rebuilt. It's pretty small. It's just kind of enough to get the job done. And then Herod the Great, who was an incredible builder. If you go to Israel, you're going to come across place after place that Herod built during his 40 some odd years. He's also crazy, but he was a really good builder. And he built the temple as a way of ingratiating himself to the Jews. And it was magnificent. It took over 40 years to build it. And we will see pictures of it here, or of a model of it here in just a second. But so that is where the temple is. It's on the eastern edge of Jerusalem, and it overlooks the Kidron Valley. We talked about the Valley of Gehenna. We talked about the Kidron Valley. Okay, so Holy Week starts with Palm Sunday. And there is a picture of Pope Francis. I thought it would be good if I updated it and put in Pope Leo, but this is kind of a fun picture. Apparently Pope Francis is really good with palms, and he was able to weave that all together. But on Palm Sunday, what do? We have palms. And we wave them. They get blessed at the beginning of Palm Sunday. And the reason we do that is because of what happened in Jesus' Holy Week. So, again, the Mount of Olives is on the east side of Jerusalem. It's on the east side of the Kidron Valley. So you have Jerusalem, it's 2,500 feet, and then the Mount of Olives probably rises another, 300 or 400 feet above Jerusalem, maybe even more than that. Okay, so here is a view of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. All right, there's some guy standing there in that picture. And so you see behind him the walls and the buildings in Jerusalem, in Old Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now bigger than that. It's expanded beyond the old walls. But they are there. I'm not sure that, I don't think it's the original walls, but the walls over time have been replaced just throughout various moments in the history of Jerusalem. In that lower right corner, you see what look like a bunch of boxes. And then in the background, you see Jerusalem. What is that? Well, the people believed that the Messiah would come from the east. Okay? And that's indeed what Jesus does, which is one of the reasons why people are all excited on Palm Sunday, is he's coming in from the east. But for those who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, they're still waiting for the Messiah. And so they are buried on either side of the Kidron Valley in these stone boxes, because it's so rocky there that to dig and to bury would just be too much. And so they just build these boxes. And in some cases, what happens is you allow the person to decay, and then you take their bones and you put them in a smaller box, a little ossuary, and then you can reuse the box that they're in as they decay. But that's the view from what is called the Church of the Dominus Flevit, which is that church there. A lot of churches in in Jerusalem and in Israel are built during the 30s and 40s. Maybe 40s and 50s, perhaps. And they're built, almost all were designed by the same Franciscan who was an architect. And this is one of them that he designed. And because Jesus weeps as he looks over Jerusalem, because he knows it's going to be eventually destroyed, because it won't return to God completely. It won't follow him, and then it won't return to God completely, and he knows it's going to get destroyed. He weeps. And so Dominus Flevit, the Lord wept, the shortest verse in all of Scripture, he designed it like a teardrop. So that's supposed to look like a teardrop. But if you're sitting in the church, looking past the altar, you look at Jerusalem in the background. Okay, so on Palm Sunday, Jesus enters Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and people come and they just pull olive branches off of all these olive trees, palm branches, palm branches, and they place them in his path as he comes across. We call it Palm Sunday. And then he crosses the Kidron Valley and enters into Jerusalem. Back here on your left is a scale model of Jerusalem in 70 AD, right before it was destroyed. There is a park in Israel, in Jerusalem, that you can go into and see this model. It was originally in a hotel lobby. I don't know how long it took the architects and the archaeologists to build it, but it was so impressive and so helpful that eventually they moved it into this park. And if you're ever in Jerusalem and your tour guide doesn't have this park as part of the tour, beg them to let you go, because things make so much more sense when you're able to look at this map, this model of Jerusalem from 70 AD, okay? So as you can see on the right of that little picture is a much bigger building. Well, that's the temple, okay? So this is a view of the temple, yeah, we'll get to that. So this is a view looking from what would be like if you were standing on the Mount of Olives. As you would look across, that's what the temple would look like. Maybe if you were kind of hovering, if you had you could be up a little bit in a balloon or something like that. And just want to make sure that okay. So there are four main areas of the temple. This is just a Lego version. I'm a big Lego fan, and when I found this online, I was like, that is awesome. Whoever built that has way too much time on their hand, but I am jealous. So this is, okay, we'll go back to this one. So there are a couple main areas. First of all, you would come in from the south, okay, and there are two entrances here, down below, and you would walk up the stairs, and then you would like pop out into the temple, all this light, and you just see this magnificent temple right in front of you, okay? And so this out here is called the courtyard of the Gentiles, because anybody who wanted to could go into that area. And then you would go further in. This is the courtyard of the Jews. Only Jews could go in there if they were taking something in to be sacrificed. So like when Mary and Joseph bring Jesus and they sacrifice what? Turtle doves, right? So they would bring them, they would have brought them into this area to be sacrificed. Okay? And then that is the Holy of Holies. It's a very special place that had the Ark of the Covenant. It had originally it had the 10 Commandments in there. There's some showbread in there. There's several things that are in there, but it's super special. And only the high priest would go in there to offer sacrifice once a year in atonement for sins, okay? And a cool little story. So because that spot is so holy, only priests could be there. And so Herod actually had, my understanding is, he had 1,000 priests trained to be stonemasons so that they could actually build the Holy of Holies because no one else could be in that space. And then there's a portico all the way around. And then there's this red-roofed portico, and that's the Roman stoa, okay? And so when Jesus cleanses the temple, he probably did it somewhere in through there. They probably were doing all their selling and exchanging of coinage and everything like that in this area, and that's where Jesus goes in and he flips the temple, or flips the tables. And that's during Holy Week, okay? So he comes in on Palm Sunday, and then he's just teaching in the temple throughout the week, and getting the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests, getting them more and more angry, the things that he's teaching about. And eventually, you know, it's on Holy Thursday when they finally apprehend him. Okay, so during our Holy Week, on Tuesday, we have something called the Chrism Mass. Okay? And the Chrism Mass is where the 3 oils that are used in the church are blessed. And the bishop blesses those, blesses them all together, and then they're in these little vials, and priests then go pick up however many vials they think they're going to go through in a year, and they take those back to their churches. So starting after Chrism Mass, we start using those oils in our celebration. And he blesses 3 oils: oil of the catechumens, oil of the sick, and chrism oil. Okay? And those, before he blesses the chrism, he pours some balsam into it. because we use 3 oils, and because chrism is used a lot, it's used in baptism, it's used in confirmation, it's used for, my hands were anointed with chrism oil when I was ordained a priest. It's used when a bishop consecrates a new altar. Because it's used in all these really important moments, to set it apart, balsam is poured into it. Makes it a little bit darker, and it makes it smell sweet. So when you receive chrism, either when you are confirmed at the Easter Vigil, your forehead's going to smell nice and sweet. So let someone that you are close to, they can smell your head. I wouldn't let everybody do it, but it does smell. If you've ever been to like a baptism of a baby, we put a bunch of it on their head, and their head smells nice and sweet after that. I actually have some beer balm or whatever it's called that's chrism smelled. I don't use it, but someone gave it to me thinking that I would want it. Okay. The oils are used for 4 different sacraments: baptism, confirmation, anointing of the sick, and holy orders. So the oil of the catechumens is used in the baptismal rite. The oil of the sick obviously is used for anointing of the sick. And then chrism again is used in baptism, confirmation, and holy orders. Okay, then we get to Holy Thursday. And this is an image of Pope Francis. I don't know if you remember, but really early in his pontificate, maybe even the first Holy Thursday back in 2013 or 2014, he went and he washed the feet of prisoners in a local prison. So I think this is an image of him washing the feet of some prisoners. Okay, so Jesus' Holy Week includes his Last Supper, amongst many other things. It's actually a very kind of packed day for Jesus. But the Last Supper happens in the upper room. And that is in the southwest portion of Jerusalem. You can see in that red box there, it is around the upper room. And so in this, the image here on the left, I think we have a close-up of it. So it's down in the area of those flat-roofed buildings. But if we look back up here, so again, here's the temple. All of these red-roofed buildings are roofs that have like a pitched roof, and they've got that Spanish or Italian tile roofing on it, okay? Those were the more expensive houses and buildings. The priests lived there, because back then the priests made lots of money. So they got to live in rather nice places. And then everything else just is more of a regular, flat-roofed sort of a thing. Well, Jesus had some sort of friend. Some speculate it might have been the mother of Mark, because there's also speculation that she owned the little area that they go to on later on Holy Thursday, Agony in the Garden. But anyway, there's some sort of house there that had 2 stories, and there was a big upper room where they would have meals. Probably had a stove in the corner so that they could make bread in it. And that was somewhere here in this lower corner. Okay, so that's just a close-up of that, one of those buildings down there. If you go there now, there's a room called the Cenacle. It's like a little chapel that is where the where the upper room was. For those of you who are really good at architectural history, you're going to look at those columns and go, well, that wouldn't have been during Jesus' time. You're right. Those are Gothic columns. So that would have been built much later than Jesus, because the upper room at some point burned, and during the Crusades they rebuilt it, okay? But anyway, this is in the spot where it's believed that Jesus had the Last Supper. Okay, we're going to talk about the Last Supper really quickly. I think I'm already behind, but that's okay. The Last Supper, this is the image that we're used to, right? Da Vinci's Last Supper. He got it right in that they're all sitting on the same side of the table, but he got the configuration of the table and where everybody is seated wrong. No offense to him. He didn't have the scholarship that we have today, but there was actually a typical way that a table would be laid out, okay? And this is what he laid out. Jesus is in the middle. John is next to him. Then Judas, then Peter. Okay? That is not the way it was actually laid out. So, it would have been more like this. The table would have been in a U shape so that the servant could go into the middle of it and bring all the food and put it in front of you. But also so that you could kind of see each other. But they didn't sit in chairs like we're used to. They had little pillows that they reclined on. So you often hear like, Jesus reclined at supper. Well, it wasn't he was like leaning back in his chair. He was actually leaning on a pillow lying on the floor. So it would have looked like that, okay? And they all would have been leaning on their left arms and using their right hands to eat, because they use their left hands for other things that you don't want to then use that hand to eat with, okay? I'll let you figure that one out. But they use their right hands to eat, so they leaned on their left, okay? And the way that it was typically laid out is that the host was the second to last person at the table. In front of them was the seat of friendship, and behind them was the guest of honor. And then it kind of went down in rank from there. The further you got away from the host, the further, the lesser your rank was. So you hear Jesus say, like, when you go to a banquet, sit at the lowest place, and then the host will come and bring you up higher. What's he talking about? Well, it's like sitting further away from the host, and then the host is like, oh, no, you're more honored than that. I'm going to move you up in rank at the table. Now, if there was no servant, the person who was at the very last spot was supposed to be the server. Okay? So, this matters. Because if we use the text from St. John about the washing of the feet, there is indication in there of where at least Jesus, John, Judas, and Peter would have been. Okay? So, that is, so we know that Jesus was the host, so he would have been in the second spot. John, we hear leaning against the chest of Jesus. Now, up until a few years ago, when I learned all of this, that was one of the most awkward phrases in all of Scripture. Like, what in the world are you? Just talk to him. Don't lean your head up against his chest. What are you doing? Well, if you think about the fact that they are laying down and one person is laying in front of the other, how would you talk to the person behind you? Like that? No. You would lean up against their chest and then you're face to face with them. Right? So it makes sense that John, if he leaned up against the chest of Jesus to talk to him, was the one sitting in front of him, or right next to him, to his right. He had the seat of friendship. We also hear Jesus talk, dipping a morsel and giving it to Judas. Well, if John's on his right, Judas had to be on his left, which is actually the guest of honor. How crazy is it that the guy who is going to betray him at the very last supper that they have together, Jesus gives him the seat of honor? Pretty crazy. Now, we hear Jesus when he washes feet, and if you notice, everybody's feet is sticking out, right? What the servant would do during the meal is they would go around, and while your feet are sticking out, they'd take your sandals off, and they would wash your feet. That was a servant's job because it was nasty. Their feet were nasty. Jesus does that. But when he gets to Peter, Peter says, oh, no, you're not supposed to wash my feet. I should be washing yours. Because if there was no servant, that last person would be the one who washed the feet. And who tells John to ask Jesus who was going to betray him? Do you remember? Peter does. If John is seated right here, he can't see anybody from that vantage point. No one would have been able to say, hey, John, ask Jesus. Except if he was looking across at Peter, or if Peter was up and going around and serving, then he could have had that sort of conversation in the middle of the meal with John. So, scholarship says that Peter was in that last spot. Okay? Now, when we talk about the Pope, one of the terms that we give for them is that they are the servant of the servants. That gets even more meaning because of this last meal, right? The Last Supper. Peter, who was the Pope, who was going to be made the Pope, he serves everyone. He's the servant of the servants. Okay. So that's the layout. That's so fascinating to me. And so I'd love to talk about that. Okay, let's keep moving. In the upper room, Jesus on Holy Thursday institutes holy orders and the Eucharist. And then on Pentecost, he institutes reconciliation and confirmation. They're all in the same space. So 4 of the 7 sacraments all were instituted in the upper room. Okay. Then Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives, which is across the Kidron Valley. So he takes his apostles through the city and into the across the Kidron Valley onto the Mount of Olives into the Garden of Gethsemane. This is looking from the north, and so you see a bunch of trees over there. Some of those are olive trees, and then you see that church down in the bottom right that's got all those domes on it. That is the Church of all nations, because a bunch of different nations donated money to build this church. It is built over the spot where Jesus wept, or Jesus had his agony in the garden. That's the front of that church. So if you go inside, the altar is over the rock where Jesus had his agony. And then outside, there's this garden with these olive trees. The olive tree on your right is 50 years old. Imagine how old the olive trees on the left are. How an olive tree grows is it shoots down these shoots on the outside, and those are the youngest part of it, like most trees. But then the inside dies, but it keeps living on in these shoots, and it just kind of turns into this big circle. And so you could actually walk inside of that one that's on the background of the left picture. Okay. Judas betrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's taken to the religious leaders, starting with the house of Caiaphas. Again, it's in one of those red-roofed buildings, okay? And now there's a church built over it called St. Peter, Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. And there's a church built over another church, which is built over the house of Caiaphas. And outside in the courtyard of this church, there's these statues of Peter denying that he knows Jesus to the servant girl. And then inside, you can look through the windows, and then there's Jesus in chains inside. And in the basement, there are these 2 cisterns that were dug in there. So a cistern is different than a well. A well taps into water that's already underground. A cistern receives water from rain and holds it, and then you can use it. And so those were in the basement of Caiaphas' house, and it's thought that maybe overnight they left Jesus down in one of those cisterns. So it's a really powerful place to pray. Okay, Jesus is apprehended. He's taken to there. And then we move into Good Friday. And at the beginning of Good Friday service, the priest and the deacons come forward and they lay face down in front of the altar during the very first part of Good Friday. So there's Pope Francis laying down. His pillow looks a lot more comfortable than the knot pillow that we use. It's a joke, but anyway. Okay, so he's brought before the Sanhedrin, who meet in that same space where Jesus flipped the tables underneath that Roman stoa in the temple. Okay, so again, there are those two entrances I talked about, and there's that Roman stoa up above, and the Sanhedrin met somewhere underneath that. They then sent him to Pilate, who would have been in the Antonia fortress. So you see that red square up there. It's not a very good square because it kind of cuts through the fortress a little bit. But the picture in the lower right, again, is the temple. And then if you look in the upper right corner of the temple, there's what looks to be a fortress, which is in the bigger picture. So the Romans built that right on the edge of the temple because there were so many Jews that would come for the feasts that they wanted to make sure they didn't rebel, and so they would kind of be looking over to make sure that they could keep track of them. And that's where Pontius Pilate would have been. That's where the Praetorium would have been. Okay, and you can actually go in there and touch first century walkways. Pretty cool. Okay, then he sends Jesus to Herod, and Herod's dad. So the Herod that Jesus is sent to is the son of the Herod who built the temple. He had a nice little palace there. He's sent over there. Herod just kind of wants a miracle, doesn't get a miracle, so he sends him back. Goes back to the fortress, the Praetorium, and he's condemned to death, and he walks the way of the cross. And so he's just walking through the streets of Jerusalem, somewhere in that box. And when you go to Rome now, you can walk the Via Dolorosa, which has different stations of the cross throughout it, if you want to walk Jesus' stations and his way of sorrow, Via Dolorosa. And then you get to where Jesus was crucified, which is outside the city walls. The city walls at Jesus' time, right? Remember, that outer wall is actually at 70 AD, but it didn't exist at Jesus' time. So the hill of Golgotha is right outside the